In 1992, at a restricted U.S. nuclear test site in the Nevada desert, a group of soldiers was assigned what appeared to be a routine escort mission. Their orders were simple: guide a small medical team underground through sealed blast tunnels, provide security, and leave once the inspection was complete. Nothing in the briefing suggested danger. Nothing hinted at an emergency. This is not a story about an alien attack, a weapons failure, or a disaster spiraling out of control. There were no explosions, no alarms, and no moments of open panic. Every step of the mission followed procedure. Every movement was deliberate. That was what made it unsettling. From the moment the escort passed below ground, the environment felt engineered for restraint. The tunnels were unusually clean for a facility that old. The air was cold and sterile, stripped of dust and smell. The lighting was harsh and angled straight down, guiding attention toward the floor instead of the walls or ceilings. Old sections that should have felt abandoned instead felt actively maintained. As the group moved deeper, subtle reactions began to occur. Faint vibrations passed through the concrete at irregular intervals, not like machinery, but like something responding. The more people gathered in one place, the more noticeable the effect became. The environment adjusted quietly, as if it were monitoring the human presence within it. The soldiers were not guarding equipment. They were not protecting infrastructure. They were moving through a containment system designed to manage something that was still alive beneath the desert. This story is about how calm procedures were used to keep it that way. The escort squad assigned to the mission was small and experienced, chosen less for firepower and more for discipline. Each soldier had a defined role and followed it without question. One handled navigation and timing. Another managed radio checks and perimeter awareness. The rest maintained spacing and formation. There was no talk of threats or contingencies beyond standard procedure. Nothing about the assignment suggested the need for heightened alert. The officer overseeing the movement was introduced simply as the mission liaison. She was polite, efficient, and emotionally distant in a way that felt deliberate. She spoke in short, precise instructions and avoided unnecessary explanation. Questions were acknowledged but rarely answered directly. Her focus remained on timing, spacing, and adherence to route. Everything about her presence suggested oversight rather than command. The medical team arrived separately. They wore neutral clothing with no visible unit patches or name tapes. Their badges were plain, their equipment sealed in hard cases, marked only with stenciled numbers. No medical insignia, no conversation beyond what was required. They moved together, practiced and quiet, as if accustomed to working in environments where attention was discouraged. None of them explained what they were inspecting. The descent began at an access point marked as inactive on most facility maps. An industrial elevator carried the group down several hundred feet. It moved smoothly but felt outdated, its walls scarred by decades of use. Warning placards from earlier testing eras peeled slightly at the corners. The air inside the elevator was already colder than expected. When the doors opened, the tunnels beyond did not look abandoned. The concrete was clean, too clean for structures that had been sealed for years. Route lines were painted clearly along the floor, guiding foot traffic with precision. The lighting was bright but narrow, angled straight down in tight cones that left the upper walls in shadow. It forced the eyes to stay low, discouraging casual observation. There was no background noise, no dripping water, no distant hum of machinery, just the sound of boots moving in sequence and controlled ventilation pushing air that carried no smell at all. The silence felt intentional, like an environment designed to eliminate distraction. As the escort moved forward, the soldiers began to notice small details that didn't align with the site's age. Some signs appeared newer than the walls they were mounted on. Access panels showed fresh sealant. Corners that should have gathered dust were clean. The tunnels didn't feel preserved. They felt serviced. The medical team stayed within the formation, occasionally slowing the group or adjusting their spacing without explanation. The liaison allowed it without comment. No one rushed. No one lingered. The entire movement followed a pace that felt rehearsed. It was still early in the mission. Nothing had gone wrong. No alarms had been triggered, but the soldiers were already aware of something subtle and difficult to define. This place wasn't being kept closed. It was being kept ready. The first inconsistencies were small enough to dismiss at a glance. Corridor labels appeared where the escort expected them, but the codes didn't always match the layouts issued during the briefing. A junction marked on the map as a straight passage split into two directions underground. Another corridor carried an extra designation that hadn't been listed anywhere in the documentation. At first, the soldiers assumed the maps were outdated. That was common in older facilities, but as they moved deeper, the discrepancies became harder to explain. Some signs looked new. Clean lettering bolted onto walls that showed decades of wear. In several places, newer placards had been mounted directly over older ones, the original labels still visible at the edges. The replacements didn't follow the same naming system. It was as if two different layouts existed at the same time, layered on top of each other. Fresh concrete appeared in places that were supposed to be untouched since the testing era. Behind maintenance panels, the escort caught brief glimpses of smooth, unblemished surfaces sealed with modern materials. The contrast was obvious. Old tunnel walls were rough and discolored. These sections looked poured recently, clean enough to reflect light. The medical team noticed these areas before anyone else did. Without comment, they adjusted their movement whenever the group passed certain side corridors. It wasn't dramatic. They didn't stop or point anything out. They simply shifted their bodies slightly, angling away from some passages while remaining perfectly aligned through others. They never looked directly down those avoided tunnels. The liaison never corrected them. When one soldier quietly asked about the altered routes, the response was brief and non-specific. Old renumbering, updated safety designations. Follow the marked path. The tone made it clear the explanation wasn't meant to invite further discussion. Then the ground responded. Wasn't loud enough to echo. It wasn't strong enough to knock anyone off balance. A faint vibration passed through the concrete beneath their boots, slow and irregular. Not the steady rhythm of machinery, not the hollow thud of settling rock. It felt closer to pressure shifting somewhere below, like weight being redistributed. The escort paused instinctively, then continued when nothing else followed. No alarms, no lights changing. The medical team checked nothing visible. The liaison didn't acknowledge it. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, the vibration lasted slightly longer, subtle but unmistakable. It moved through the floor and faded, leaving the tunnels just as silent as before. The air didn't change, the lights didn't flicker. The environment absorbed the disturbance without reacting outwardly. That was when the pattern became harder to ignore. The vibrations seemed to occur after changes in formation. When the group tightened, the sensation returned. When spacing increased, it faded. The tunnels didn't feel unstable. They felt responsive. The realization settled quietly among the escort. They weren't walking through a static facility. They were moving through a system that was being adjusted as they progressed. Whatever lay beneath the Nevada test site wasn't sealed and forgotten. It was being managed in real time. The device appeared for the first time without announcement. One of the medical team members wore it on his wrist, partially hidden beneath his sleeve. It didn't resemble any standard monitoring equipment. There was no screen, no buttons, no visible indicators. It emitted a faint, steady hum, quiet enough to be missed unless someone stood close. At first, the sound blended into the controlled ventilation, but as the escort slowed near a junction, the hum shifted slightly in tone, not louder, just different. The medical team noticed immediately. One of them tapped the side of the device with 2 fingers. The hum steadied. The group adjusted their spacing by half a step, subtle enough that it looked natural. A moment later, a faint vibration passed through the floor again, weaker than before, almost restrained. That was when the soldiers began to connect the details. As the escort continued, the pattern repeated. When more personnel clustered together, the vibrations returned stronger and more frequent. When spacing increased, they faded. It wasn't random. It wasn't environmental instability. The reactions followed human proximity with uncomfortable precision. The lighting changed as well. Without flickering or obvious movement, the downward angled lights tightened their focus when formations compressed. Shadows sharpened under boots. Peripheral areas dimmed just enough to discourage looking away from the path. When the group spread out again, the light relaxed, widening slightly as if pressure had been reduced. No switches were touched, no commands were given. The environment adjusted itself. The medical team continued to work quietly within the formation. The wrist device hummed at different pitches depending on where they stood. Occasionally, a medic would glance at it, nod once, and subtly reposition the group. These corrections weren't about navigation. They were about balance. One soldier finally asked what the device measured. The answer came without detail. Environmental response. Nothing more. As they moved deeper, it became clear the escort wasn't there to protect the medical team from danger. The medics weren't reacting to threats ahead. They were reacting to the soldiers themselves. Human presence triggered changes. Density mattered. Attention mattered. The system below didn't respond to weapons, noise, or aggression. It responded to proximity and focus. The realization settled in quietly. They weren't observers walking through an underground facility. They were inputs. Every step, every pause, every tightened formation altered the environment around them. The tunnels weren't passive. They were monitoring the number of people, how close they stood, and how much attention they directed outward. The soldiers adjusted instinctively after that. Spacing increased. Movements slowed. Eyes stayed down. Not because they were ordered to, but because the environment responded more calmly when they did. By the time they reached the next junction, the truth was difficult to ignore. The mission wasn't about escorting specialists through old tunnels. It was about measuring how human presence affected whatever was still active beneath the desert. Confirmation didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. It came quietly, through material that wasn't meant to be seen by the escort team at all. The records were stored in an unused terminal room near one of the older access points. The space looked abandoned at first glance, Dust on the desks, inactive screens, outdated equipment pushed against the walls. But inside a locked cabinet were documents that didn't match the rest of the facility's history. Handwritten logs, typed reports on aging paper, technical notes dated decades earlier than the nuclear tests that had made the site famous. Some of the pages predated the first underground detonations entirely. The language used in the reports was careful and restrained. No sensational claims, no speculation, just repeated references to an anomalous presence detected during early excavation work. The notes described unexpected voids, irregular tunnel geometry, and reactions in the surrounding rock that didn't align with natural formations. Several entries warned against direct observation. The phrase appeared more than once, underlined in different hands across different years. The warnings weren't about radiation exposure or structural collapse. They referenced behavioral responses, changes in pressure, shifts in subterranean stability, and reactions triggered by focused human attention. According to the older documents, something had already been there when construction began. The test site hadn't uncovered it by accident. It had been built around it. The early nuclear detonations changed that balance. Later reports described increased instability following major tests, pressure anomalies, structural stress far below expected blast zones, environmental reactions that couldn't be explained by heat or shock waves alone. The presence responded not to the explosions themselves, but to the disruption they caused deep underground. Restraints were introduced gradually. At first, they were described as stabilization measures, reinforcements, barriers, isolation protocols. Over time, the language shifted. The documents stopped referring to excavation concerns and began focusing on containment thresholds, exposure limits, and population density controls. The entity was never described as hostile. There were no references to attacks, aggression, or intent. Every response recorded was reactive, not active. It adjusted when disturbed. It stabilized when left alone. The problem wasn't that it posed a threat. The problem was that human activity had made it unstable. That was the critical clarification the escort team had been missing. Containment wasn't designed to imprison something dangerous. It was designed to compensate for damage already done. The tunnels, the lighting, the controlled air, the strict movement rules. None of it was about security in the traditional sense. It was about minimizing interference. The warnings about observation suddenly made sense. The angled lighting, the emphasis on keeping eyes down, the medical team's insistence on spacing, the wrist device tracking proximity rather than location. The system wasn't built to stop the entity from escaping. It was built to stop humans from making the situation worse. By the time the escort team finished reviewing what they could, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Nevada test site hadn't created something beneath the desert. It had discovered something already there. Something older than the facility, older than the tests, and sensitive to disruption. What lay below wasn't being punished or restrained out of fear. It was being managed because human presence, unchecked and unaware, had already proven capable of destabilizing it. The first major disturbance didn't arrive with warning sounds or flashing indicators. It came as a single heavy pulse that moved through the structure beneath their feet. The concrete didn't crack, the lights didn't fail, but the force of it was unmistakable. Deep, slow, and deliberate, like pressure shifting far below the tunnel floor. The escort stopped without being told. The sensation wasn't violent. It didn't throw anyone off balance. It felt closer to a response than an attack. as if something beneath the site had registered a change and adjusted itself accordingly. The medical team reacted immediately. They tightened their formation, then just as quickly loosened it. One of them checked the wrist device, watching the hum drop in pitch as spacing increased. Another raised a hand slightly. Not a signal of danger, but a quiet request for patience. The liaison officer didn't issue commands. She waited. A second pulse followed, weaker than the first. That was when part of the truth finally surfaced. One of the medical team members spoke in a low voice, careful with every word. The reactions weren't breaches or failures. They were feedback. The entity below wasn't acting out. It was responding to changes in human presence, specifically density and attention. More people in one place increased strain. Focused observation intensified it further. There were still no signs of aggression, no movement toward the tunnels, no attempt to break containment, no indication of intent. Every response recorded by the medical team followed the same pattern. Pressure increased when disturbed, then eased when interference was reduced. The escort began to understand what they were witnessing. Fear had framed the situation incorrectly from the beginning. The instinct was to assume a threat, something restrained because it was dangerous, but nothing in the data supported that. The entity didn't pursue. It didn't resist containment violently. It didn't escalate on its own. It adjusted. When human activity intensified, it reacted. When the environment quieted, it stabilized. The wrist device confirmed it repeatedly. As formations loosened and movement slowed, the hum softened, the vibrations diminished. The lighting relaxed slightly, widening its downward focus, as if pressure had been relieved. The system was responsive, not defensive. That realization changed everything. The problem wasn't what the entity did. It was how humans affected it. The nuclear tests hadn't awakened something hostile. They had disrupted something balanced. Decades of reinforcement and restriction hadn't imprisoned a threat. They had tried to compensate for the consequences of that disruption. The medical team never used words like danger or enemy. They spoke in terms of thresholds and tolerance, exposure limits, response curves, stability windows. The language belonged to environmental management, not security. Operations. The escort adjusted instinctively. Spacing increased. Movements became slower, more deliberate. Eyes stayed down, not out of fear, but understanding. The environment responded in kind. The tunnels grew quieter. The pressure in the air eased. The faint vibrations faded into the background, barely perceptible. Nothing was fixed, but nothing worsened. For the first time since entering the site, the soldiers understood the role they were playing. They weren't guarding against an attack. They were participating in a delicate balancing act, one where human presence itself was the variable most likely to cause failure. The elevator activated without being called. There was no button pressed, no verbal instruction, no warning chime. The doors simply slid open as the group stood at the junction, revealing an interior that hadn't been listed on any access schedule. The liaison officer noticed it at the same moment as the medical team. No one looked surprised. That, more than anything, unsettled the escort. The decision was made quickly and quietly. The formation tightened, then adjusted again. Spacing increased just enough to keep pressure low. The medical team stepped in first. The soldiers followed. As soon as the doors closed, the elevator began to descend. It moved differently than before. The ride was smoother, quieter, almost guided. There was no vibration from cables or machinery. The sensation felt controlled, deliberate, as if the system knew exactly where it was going and how fast it needed to get there. The temperature dropped steadily. Cold air pressed against exposed skin, dry and sterile, carrying no smell. Breath became visible for a moment before settling. No one spoke. Radios remained silent. The wrist device hummed at a low, steady pitch, unchanged. When the elevator slowed, there was no indicator to mark the level. The doors opened onto a corridor that did not resemble the rest of the facility. The walls were smooth and continuous, without visible seams, bolts, or support joints. The geometry was wrong for industrial construction, curved in places where straight lines were expected, subtly rounded in a way that felt intentional rather than engineered. The floor absorbed sound, dulling the echo of boots. Lighting ran along the edges instead of overhead, guiding movement forward while keeping the upper space dim. This wasn't a tunnel built for equipment. It was a passage designed to be moved through carefully. Before anyone stepped out, the rules were restated. Eyes down, no direct focus, no sudden movements. If attention drifted upward, it was to be corrected immediately. Peripheral vision only. The escort complied without question. As they moved forward, the sensation of presence became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a sound or a visible shape. It was pressure, a subtle awareness that filled the space like standing near a powerful machine that hadn't activated yet. The air felt heavier, not with weight, but with intention. The soldiers didn't feel fear. Fear implied threat, and there was none. What they felt was proximity. Occasionally, something shifted at the edge of perception, a change in shadow, a movement that refused to settle into a recognizable form. Whenever someone's focus drifted too far, the pressure intensified slightly, not painfully, just enough to encourage correction. The wrist device responded instantly, its hum rising, then lowering as attention redirected. The environment enforced its own rules. The escort moved slower now, not because they were told to, but because the space demanded it. The medical team placed measured steps, guiding the group along a path that curved gently forward. No markings identified where they were. No signs named the level. They had passed below authorized access. The architecture continued to change as they progressed. Restraints appeared along the walls, not metal, not mechanical. Smooth recesses shaped into the structure itself, worn and polished as if they had been used for a long time. Some were empty. Others showed subtle impressions, pressure marks left behind. No one commented on them. The presence grew stronger, but never aggressive. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply existed, aware of movement, responsive to attention. The escort understood then that what lay deeper wasn't watching them in the way humans watched. It was sensing. By the time the group reached the final threshold, the realization was complete. They weren't descending toward a threat. They were entering the space of something that had been there long before the tunnels. Something that didn't need to be feared, but required distance, restraint, and respect to remain stable. The explanation came without ceremony. Near the edge of the lower chamber, the medical team gathered around a low console embedded directly into the floor. There were no blinking alerts, no warning tones. The wrist device hummed steadily as one of them spoke, his voice controlled and precise. The restraints were failing, not breaking, not being forced open. They were losing effectiveness as the system adapted. Decades of layered containment, barriers, pressure controls, behavioral limits had reached the edge of what they could compensate for. Continued restriction, the handler explained, would not maintain stability. It would increase strain. The structure wasn't designed to hold indefinitely. It was designed to adjust. The liaison officer listened without interruption. The escort remained still, maintaining distance. The presence in the chamber didn't intensify. It waited, unchanged, as if aware that a decision was being made. The handler continued. The entity responded to imbalance. Human interference had created that imbalance long ago. Containment had reduced the symptoms, but not the cause. Over time, restriction itself had become a stressor. Pressure had nowhere to go. If the restraints remained fully engaged, the next response wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be violent either. It would be structural. The choice wasn't between control and release. It was between interference and withdrawal. The decision followed naturally. A gradual release protocol was authorized, not an opening of doors or removal of barriers, but a reduction in artificial limits. Restraints would retract in stages, allowing the system to settle into a configuration closer to its original state. No one framed it as setting something free. They framed it as stepping back. The medical team moved carefully, activating the sequence without urgency. As the first restraints disengaged, the change was immediate but controlled. A low vibration passed through the chamber, steadier than before. The pressure in the air shifted, not upward or outward, but inward, as if tension were being redistributed rather than expelled. The wrist device reflected it instantly. The hum dropped in pitch, smoothing into a consistent tone. As additional restraints withdrew, the environment followed suit. The downward pressure eased. The lighting softened slightly. The chamber felt less dense, less reactive. Nothing surged forward. Nothing pressed against the boundaries. The presence moved, not toward the escort, not toward the upper levels, but deeper. The sensation of proximity receded, replaced by a quieter awareness farther below. Whatever occupied the chamber was returning to a space it recognized, one that had existed before the tunnels, before the reinforcements, before the site itself. Stability readings climbed. The vibrations settled into a slow, rhythmic pulse, faint enough to be felt only when standing still. The air no longer resisted breath. The structure absorbed the change without protest. The escort remained where they were, eyes down, spacing unchanged. There was no celebration, no visible relief, just confirmation. Containment levels normalized. The handlers began withdrawing their equipment, sealing interfaces as they went. The liaison officer issued instructions to clear the chamber in the same calm tone she had used all day. No rush, no deviation. As the group moved back toward the elevator, the space behind them adjusted again, not closing, not locking, but reshaping quietly, as if the chamber no longer required oversight. By the time they ascended, the environment felt different, not empty, resolved. The realization followed them upward, settling in without drama. They hadn't freed anything. They had stopped interfering with something that had never needed imprisonment. Only distance, restraint, and the absence of unnecessary human attention to remain stable beneath the desert. The aftermath was handled with the same restraint as the operation itself. The escort team filed their reports according to procedure. Timelines, movements, environmental observations. Nothing emotional, nothing speculative, just facts. When the documents were returned, several pages were missing, not redacted. Removed cleanly. The staple holes were still there, but the content that described the lower levels, the adjustments, and the release protocol was gone. No explanation was given. Within days, the medical team vanished from the site. Their temporary workspaces were cleared. Equipment logs showed their cases checked out, then erased. Badge records no longer listed their identifiers. Even the call signs used during the escort ceased to exist in the system, as if they had never been assigned. The lower sector was closed permanently. Concrete trucks arrived under routine work orders. Access tunnels were filled and sealed beneath layers of reinforced material. New warning. Placards were mounted at the last authorized level, citing structural instability and safety concerns. No one questioned it. No one was invited to. An official explanation followed shortly after. Minor seismic irregularities, aging infrastructure, precautionary closure. The language was clean, boring, and sufficient to end discussion. The site resumed normal operations above ground without interruption. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. No alarms, no evacuations, no unexplained incidents. The test site remained quiet. The desert stayed still. Years passed. Satellite imagery showed no new construction in the sealed sector. Internal records showed no requests to reopen it. Training rotations continued. Personnel cycled in and out. The lower levels remained untouched. Those who had been part of the escort carried on with their assignments. None of them spoke publicly about what they had witnessed. There was no reason to. Everything that mattered had already been buried, physically and administratively. Yet some details never fully disappeared. Occasionally, maintenance sensors deeper in the site registered a faint, rhythmic fluctuation. Not enough to trigger alerts, not enough to justify investigation. A steady pulse that remained consistent year after year, easily dismissed as residual ground movement. It was never labeled a problem, because it wasn't one. Whatever existed beneath the Nevada desert no longer reacted to human presence. It remained where it belonged, deeper than the tunnels, beyond the reach of routine activity. The system above it stayed stable precisely because it was left alone. The site didn't need guards anymore. Some things don't need guards. They need distance.